The Willow Creek Nursing Home is not a place where people go to recover. It's a place where they go to be forgotten. The entire facility is bathed in a perpetual, sickly yellow light, and the air is thick with the scent of disinfectant and a deep, underlying note of cinnamon. The unsettling quiet is broken only by the rhythmic squeak-squeak of a rolling cart. They say the place is run by a single, ageless nurse who never changes her shift, a malevolent entity disguised in starched white, who tends not to the living, but to the slow, agonizing departure of the soul. Elias, a private investigator looking into a string of unexplained resident deaths, arrived at midnight. The only sound his boots on the highly polished linoleum. He found the nurse's station empty. The single flickering screen on the monitor displaying a chaotic, erratic pattern of heart rate flatlines. Then, the rhythmic squeak-squeak of the cart began, coming from the end of the long, yellow-lit corridor, growing closer with an unnatural, deliberate slowness. The squeaking cart finally emerged from the shadows. It was pushed by a figure of terrifying stillness. The nurse. She was tall, impossibly thin, dressed in an antique, perfectly starched white uniform and cap. Her face was smooth, unblemished, and utterly devoid of expression. Her eyes two wide, dark voids that seemed to swallow the dim light. She pushed a stainless steel cart covered with a white cloth, a profound stillness radiating from her entire being. As she glided past Elias, the rhythmic squeak-squeak of the cart was immediately replaced by a low, constant hiss, a sound like a small gas leak emanating from the cart itself. She stopped at room 212, the room of the last deceased resident, and slowly, deliberately, pulled the white cloth off the cart. It was not a medical cart. It was a single, massive, antique hourglass, filled with what looked like fine silver sand. The sand was not moving. The nurse turned her featureless face toward Elias, the dark voids of her eyes unnervingly fixed on his position. She did not speak, but the low hiss from the hourglass intensified, followed by a voice, thin, reedy, and profoundly bored, speaking from the heart of the metal. The schedule requires adherence. The hourglass is stopped. The transfer is due. Elias looked at the motionless sand in the inverted hourglass. It wasn't sand. It was a shimmering, silvery powder that seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. He realized the terrifying transaction. The nurse was the keeper of time, a psychic leech, freezing the essence of the departing soul, the silver sand, until the body's final, complete surrender. The hiss was the sound of the life force being slowly, painfully extracted. The nurse reached out a hand, her movement fluid and impossibly slow, and began to turn the massive hourglass. The second the hourglass was inverted, the silver sand began to fall. But it wasn't a gentle flow. It was a torrential cascade, the sound a roaring, frantic white noise that filled the corridor. The nurse's mouth, which had been a thin, featureless line, slowly began to stretch and widen into a terrifyingly wide, silent smile of profound satisfaction. Elias, propelled by pure animal panic, sprinted toward room 212. He had to stop the process, to break the flow of the silver sand. He smashed the glass observation window of the room with his flashlight. The sound a deafening explosion that fractured the roaring white noise. The light from his shattered lamp fell onto the room's occupant, a wizened, pale old woman on the bed. As he watched, the woman's final faint breath escaped her lips, and a plume of the shimmering silver sand burst from her mouth, flying through the broken window toward the hourglass. Elias grabbed the bedside lamp and hurled it at the nurse's hourglass cart. The lamp struck the base, and the entire structure, the massive glass bulb and the silvery sand, shattered on the linoleum in a silent, freezing explosion. The roaring white noise stopped instantly. The nurse shrieked, a high-pitched electronic screech that sounded like a defibrillator flatlining, and her body snapped back, rigid and completely still. The terrifying smile vanished, and the featureless face sagged into a mask of pure absolute frustration. Elias scrambled backward, watching the nurse slowly, methodically, begin to collect the spilled silver sand with her bare hands, meticulously sweeping the powder into a small, antique silver thimble. The intense cold began to recede. Elias ran, never looking back. Days later, he checked the obituaries. The woman in room 212 had been officially declared deceased at 12:05 a.m. He had escaped, but a tiny, rhythmic squeak now came from his own coat pocket. He reached in and pulled out a single, massive, perfect grain of fine, silvery sand. The nurse had simply saved a sample of the disrupted time. Subscribe to Whisper Dark for more.